Historians tell us that Oslo was founded in the year 1040, destroyed by fire during the Maunder Grand Solar Minimum in 1624 and rebuilt after. The old stone buildings and cathedrals still remain and boast astounding feats of architecture and master stonemasonry that cannot easily be reproduced today, if at all. Yet everywhere you go, these genius stonemasons and builders apparently seem to have been too stupid to know that there is no point in putting 20-foot-high windows underground looking out into the dirt, nor is it a good idea for the structural integrity of the building. This stairwell was built in 1895, but it's clear the buildings on top are as deep and old as the buildings 20 feet below it. This excavation under a building alleging to be from 1916 showed that there was at least 20 more feet of building and 2 columns of windows below the street level. Do these grandiose arches really look the right proportion for that door? Come on. This doorway sits in a building claiming to be a new addition to the Oslo Dome Church, built in 1854. Though the statues next to it have church fathers from the early 1800s. Uptown lies this massive Roman Greco stone structure, dug out 40 feet below street level under the building above it, claiming to be of the same age. You have to wonder how many more stories might be found beneath that building if you dug. Yet in the areas of the city down by sea level, these stonemasons seem perfectly capable of building level buildings on sloped streets with not one window to be found at or below ground level. There were just too many to take pictures of. They were literally everywhere. You most likely have them in your city too. Have a look. I spent a few days scouring the oldest cemetery in Oslo. I could not find one person born before the year 1802. Other than the bishop of the Dome Church born in 1797. This was right during the Dalton Grand Solar Minimum. Not that it proves or disproves the mud flood possibility, but a look at Oslo's population over the last 360 years does raise more than a few eyebrows. According to the UN, Oslo has averaged a conservative 1.47% annual population growth since 1950. Using the population exponential growth formula of 70 divided by that 1.47%, we get Oslo's population doubling roughly every 47.6 years. I know, Mark, I said conservative estimate. Back in the Dalton Grand Solar Minimum of the early 1800s, there should have been roughly 60,000 people living in Oslo, and nearly 25,000 of them born in the mid-1700s ready to die by then, but the graves are nowhere to be found in the cemeteries. When you look back further to 1662 in the Maunder Grand Solar Minimum of the mid-1600s, there are only 7,000 people alive. How can this be for a city that was founded 600 years earlier? Less African lions were roaming Norway in the 1700s, It seems clear the Norwegians had advanced knowledge of the ancient lunar and stellar cults and esoteric sciences. It's self-evident that the divine feminine principles of care, nurturing, and regeneration were sacred, worshipped, and adored above all by the early culture. A far cry from the male-dominated Norse mythology peddled in our so-called history books. Suddenly, the theme changes to a radically different reality. Water is burnt by fire. The solar cult takes over, and the sacred feminine is crushed beneath its feet. No longer allowed to frolic in the garden. That blatant brickwork leaves you wondering what might have been hanging there before he got there. Scandinavian cities are littered with Roman Greco architecture, pillars, and you unpreventedly run across multiple buildings adorned not with the gods of Norse mythology, but Hermes, otherwise known as Mercury. No, not that one. This one. He's usually fixed to a building adorned with a space-aged copper antenna with a mercury ball on top, facing into a public square towards lamp poles with Jetson-esque antenna or mercury balls on top of them. Remember the stories of the old Victorian lamplighters using long sticks with candles, or sometimes on top of ladders? Well, sometimes these lamps are 40 feet in the air with nowhere to set the ladder and no way to easily get in the bulb. It got me thinking. As I was strolling into the park, I was thinking, whatever happened to the Spice Girls? What if the Kennedy body doubles were shot and that was the real conspiracy? I wonder if Norwegian women sunbathe topless like the Danish girls. And then I saw them, side by side. Why would you be replacing this with this right next to it if the wiring was already there? Wouldn't you just replace it? Antique lamps with copper tops and mercury balls, some of them 30 to 40 feet high, where you needed to take the top off just to light the light. It didn't make sense. I thought if there was a wireless transmitter, it had to be higher up and close. And it was. Is it possible this building once powered the lamps for the entire Victorian park? At the base of the park sits a church with this strange copper device on top, And all of the buildings around are always the same. Giant space-age antenna made of metal or copper, sitting on an octagon geometric base with some kind of ball on top. You see them in every city around the world. The churches and street lamps always have the same as the buildings. Space-age antenna with a ball on top, often with an octagon geometry. Was this some kind of atmospheric plasmic wireless energy system in these cities not so long ago? You have to wonder if Tesla invented this stuff or just rediscovered it. Is that why the Greek god Hermes or the Roman Mercury is all over these Scandinavian buildings? If the idea of using buildings as energy transmitters sounds far-fetched, consider this. Pure copper is rarely found in nature, so it is usually combined with other chemicals to form copper ores. Copper ore contains dirt, clay, and other minerals. Copper mining is done by drilling and blasting with explosives. These mines are usually a mile or two wide, then crushing them with huge cone crushing machines into smaller pieces, then mixing that with water, crushing that in a rod mill, then crushing that in two ball mills, then mixing that with chemical reagents, adding a frother like pine oil or long-chain alcohol, pumped into flotation tanks where air is injected, and the chemical reagents make the copper particles cling to the bubbles as they rise. And that only makes copper concentrate, which is 25 to 35% copper. That has to be fed into a furnace with a silica flux and smelted with enriched oxygen flashes, so the iron and silica flux chemically bond and the sulfur and oxygen make sulfur dioxide. Then that has to be added to two more furnaces with more silica flux and then given an acid bath to end up with 99% copper. Then that has to be refined with a sodium carbonate flux and then electro-refined. Copper is ugly, but it's also highly conductive. So why did they go through all of that painstaking trouble to stick it all over their lamps and buildings? Food for thought. Thanks for watching.